Helen Carter stood in her quiet home, the sound of the clock echoing louder than her own breath. At 58, she had retired earlier than expected and recently ended a long marriage. The house, once filled with laughter and conversations, now felt like a shell. Every corner reminded her of a life she no longer had. She sat by the window, watching the waves crash in the distance. Loneliness became her uninvited companion. It was not the kind of solitude she once enjoyed, reading books or sipping tea. This silence carried weight, pressing against her chest. She asked herself a question she had avoided for months. Who am I now? The uncertainty frightened her. She had roles once wife, professional, but what remained? The days stretched endlessly. Helen walked from room to room, picking up objects that carried memories of a past she could not bring back. A photograph on the wall, a souvenir from a trip, even the old teapot on the stove whispered of years gone by. She wondered if the best parts of her life had already ended. The thought brought tears she quickly wiped away. She remembered advice from her mother long ago. When you don't know what to do, take one step, any step. That memory nudged her to leave the house for a walk. Her feet carried her toward the beach nearby, a place she had ignored for years while caught up in routines. The ocean had always calmed her. On the sand, she felt the wind against her face and the vastness of the horizon. It was humbling. The waves reminded her that life moved forward, whether she joined it or not. She stayed until the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Something in her chest loosened, just a little. That night, Helen opened an old drawer and found a forgotten notebook. Its pages were mostly blank, waiting for words. She touched the cover gently, as if greeting an old friend. Maybe writing could help her untangle her feelings. She placed it on her nightstand, unsure but hopeful. As she turned off the light, Helen whispered to herself, maybe tomorrow I will begin. And though fear still lingered, there was also a spark that hinted her story was far from over. Tomorrow, the beach would call again. Helen returned to the beach the next morning, notebook in hand. She sat on a weathered bench overlooking the sea. At first, the blank page seemed to mock her, daring her to write. She hesitated, unsure what to say. Then, almost without thinking, she wrote the word alone. The word looked heavy on the page, but instead of scaring her, it gave her relief. She began to pour out her thoughts, writing about the silence of her house, the ache of memories, the confusion of starting over. Each sentence lifted a little of the weight she carried. She filled 3 pages without noticing time pass. When she looked up, the waves still rolled, endless and patient. Helen realized the ocean mirrored her life, sometimes calm, sometimes stormy, but always moving. She thought about how she, too, needed to move, even if she did not yet know where. That small truth comforted her. Over the next days, she returned daily. Her notebook became a place for honesty. She did not judge her words or try to be elegant. She simply allowed herself to be real. Some entries were sad, others carried sparks of hope. All of them reminded her that she was still here, still capable of feeling. One afternoon, as she walked back from the beach, Helen stopped at a small cafe she had often ignored. Its windows glowed warmly. The smell of coffee drifted outside, inviting her in. For the first time in weeks, she considered stepping into a place filled with people. Her heart quickened at the thought. She pushed the door open, feeling nervous yet curious. The bell above jingled softly. Inside, locals chatted, the sound of voices wrapping around her like a gentle blanket. She ordered tea and sat near the window, observing quietly. It felt strange, but not unwelcome. Helen thought. Maybe life isn't asking me to leap, only to take small steps. That evening, she promised herself she would return. She didn't know why, but something told her this cafe held the next chapter of her story. The cafe soon became a small refuge. Helen noticed familiar faces returning each morning, elderly couple who shared muffins, a young mother with her child, and a group of retirees who played cards. Their laughter filled the air. It was comforting, like music in the background of her life. One day while she sipped her tea, an older woman named Margaret approached her table. With a warm smile, Margaret asked if Helen was new in town. They talked briefly, and Margaret mentioned a community group that met weekly to share stories and support each other. Helen listened politely, though hesitation filled her. Still, the idea lingered in her mind after Margaret left. A group of people sharing experiences, wasn't that what she needed? Her fear of rejection battled with her longing for connection. She remembered the relief of writing in her notebook. Maybe speaking aloud could bring a similar release. Over the following days, Margaret greeted Helen whenever she visited the cafe. Her friendliness softened Helen's doubts. She began to realize she didn't need to face everything alone. A small voice inside whispered, "Say yes." But courage takes time to grow. That evening, Helen sat with her journal again. She wrote about her encounter with Margaret and the group she had mentioned. On the page, the words looked less intimidating than they sounded in her head. She began to imagine what it might feel like to walk into that meeting. Her pen slowed as she asked herself a hard question. Am I brave enough to go? The thought frightened her, but also stirred something hopeful. She underlined the word brave 3 times, almost as a secret reminder. Helen closed the notebook and stared at the ocean outside. Maybe I can try, she whispered. The waves seemed to answer back, steady and unafraid. Tomorrow, she decided, she would go. Helen stood outside the community center, her heart pounding. She almost turned back, but Margaret waved from the doorway, her presence a gentle encouragement. Taking a deep breath, Helen stepped inside. The room buzzed with quiet conversations and the smell of coffee. She chose a seat near the back, her hands folded tightly in her lap. People of different ages shared stories, some about loss, others about new beginnings. Helen listened, surprised by how deeply their words resonated with her. For the first time in months, she didn't feel invisible. When it was her turn to speak, fear nearly silenced her. Her throat tightened and her palms grew sweaty. But the expectant faces around her were kind, patient. She spoke softly about retiring, about the emptiness of her house, and the uncertainty of who she was now. The room stayed quiet, listening. To her surprise, no one judged her. Instead, a few nodded with understanding. Margaret smiled, as if saying, "You're not alone." Helen felt warmth spread through her chest. She had shared only a fragment of her truth, but it was enough to feel connected. After the meeting, someone thanked her for her honesty. Another person said her words reminded them of their own struggles. Helen realized her story carried value, even in its unfinished state. She walked home lighter than when she arrived. That night, her journal pages reflected her gratitude. She wrote about the courage it took to speak, and the relief that followed. She described the faces of those who had listened, how their presence had given her strength. She underlined one sentence, "Belonging begins with honesty." As she closed the notebook, she felt a flicker of anticipation. The group had invited her back next week. This time, instead of dread, she felt a small, growing eagerness. Something was shifting. Despite the progress, Helen was not free from old wounds. Some evenings, loneliness returned with sharp edges. She would sit in her quiet living room, memories of her marriage flooding back. The silence reminded her of arguments never resolved, of dreams once shared and now broken. She found herself leafing through old photo albums, smiles, vacations, holidays, frozen moments of a life that seemed to belong to someone else. Tears blurred her vision as she wondered if she had wasted too many years. Regret pressed heavily on her shoulders, pulling her into the past. Yet in the middle of her sadness, Helen noticed something. These photos showed her strength. The woman in them had built a home, raised herself through struggles, and endured heartbreak. She had not disappeared. She had simply changed. That realization sparked a subtle pride. The next morning, she carried her notebook to the beach again. She wrote about her past, but this time not with bitterness. Instead, she wrote about what she had learned: the patience, the resilience, the courage to start again. Her words became less about loss and more about survival. One sentence stood out: "The past shaped me, but it does not define me." She read it aloud, letting the ocean carry the sound away, saying it felt like reclaiming a part of herself. Hope crept in quietly, like the tide rising along the shore. Later, at the cafe, Margaret joined her table again. They spoke of life's twists and the courage it takes to rebuild. Margaret suggested that sometimes the heart heals best when it serves others. The idea lingered in Helen's mind like an unopened gift. As she walked home, Helen wondered what it would mean to serve others. She didn't know the answer yet, but she sensed that soon an opportunity would arrive, one that would test her courage in new ways. The opportunity came sooner than Helen expected. Her young neighbor, Emily, knocked on her door one afternoon. Emily, a teacher, explained that her students were working on a writing project and needed volunteers to guide them. She asked if Helen might help. At first, Helen froze. Share her words with others. The idea seemed daunting, yet she remembered Margaret's words about serving others. Perhaps this was her chance. Though nervous, she agreed. Emily's face lit up with gratitude, easing Helen's doubts. The following week, Helen walked into the classroom. Dozens of curious young eyes turned toward her. Her palms grew damp, and for a moment she wanted to flee. But Emily introduced her warmly, calling her a writer. The title startled Helen, yet also stirred something within. She sat with a small group of students. They asked questions about storytelling, about how to turn feelings into words. Helen shared her experiences from her journal, surprised at how naturally the advice flowed. The students listened intently, scribbling notes. One boy asked, "Why do people write?" Helen paused, then answered softly, "Because sometimes the heart speaks better through ink than through voice." The boy nodded as if he understood completely. That moment etched itself into her memory. As the session ended, Emily thanked her again, saying the students admired her honesty. Helen walked home with her notebook tucked under her arm, her steps lighter. She realized she had something to offer, something she had overlooked for years. That night, Helen wrote in her journal, "Helping others helps me, too." She felt a sense of purpose blooming quietly, like a seed pushing through the soil. Something was beginning to grow. A week later, Emily asked Helen to return. This time, she wanted Helen to read one of her own pieces to the class. Panic rose in Helen's chest. Sharing her private words felt terrifying. What if they laughed? What if they didn't care? For days, Helen wrestled with the decision. She sat with her notebook, reading through her entries. Each page was raw and personal. Could she really open her heart in front of strangers, even if they were children? Courage whispered yes, but fear shouted no. On the morning of the class, Helen nearly called to cancel, but something inside her pushed forward. She chose a short passage about walking along the beach, feeling lost, yet hopeful. With trembling hands, she carried the notebook into the classroom, standing before the students. Her voice shook as she began to read. At first, her words sounded fragile, uncertain, but as she continued, she felt a shift. The students leaned in, listening with wide eyes. Their silence was not rejection, it was respect. When she finished, the room filled with applause. Helen's cheeks flushed, her heart swelling with unexpected pride. A few students even asked questions about how she found the courage to write so honestly. For the first time in years, she felt seen, bathing, home. Helen replayed the moment again and again. She realized her words had touched others, even in their simplicity. That truth filled her with hope. Writing was no longer just for herself, it could also be for the world. That evening, she wrote one sentence with bold certainty: "I have a voice worth sharing." The fear had not vanished, but courage now stood beside it, steady and real. With each passing week, Helen built a rhythm. Mornings at the beach, afternoons at the cafe, evenings with her journal. She volunteered at the school once a week, her confidence slowly growing. The days no longer felt empty but meaningful. She noticed changes in herself. She smiled more, spoke with neighbors, and even redecorated her home to feel brighter. Small victories stacked upon each other like stepping stones. Each step made the next one easier. Margaret often joined her for tea, offering encouragement and wisdom. "Purpose isn't found all at once," she said. "It grows just like you're growing." Helen treasured these conversations, holding on to them like precious gems. Despite her progress, Helen sometimes felt restless. Though her routine brought comfort, she longed for something bigger, something that would stretch her beyond familiar boundaries. She sensed her journey was far from complete. One evening, as she closed her notebook, she wrote, "I am ready for more, though I don't yet know what more is." The words felt both exciting and uncertain. She knew she couldn't stay in the safety of her small circle forever. A new challenge was waiting. Though she could not see its shape yet, life had a way of surprising her when she least expected it. And soon, a storm would come, not just in the sky, but in her life, shaking her into the next chapter of growth. A heavy rainstorm swept through town, flooding the beach paths Helen loved. She stood at her window, watching waves pound angrily against the shore. The storm outside mirrored the storm in her heart. A sudden resurgence of doubts and fears. Memories of her failed marriage resurfaced. Had she truly moved forward, or was she only distracting herself with routines? The thunder echoed her uncertainty. She feared slipping back into loneliness, the dark pit she thought she had left behind. That the next day, the community group met despite the weather. Helen almost stayed home, but Margaret called, insisting she come. Reluctantly, she went, soaked by rain yet welcomed by warm smiles. Sharing her fears aloud, she admitted how fragile her progress felt. Others nodded, offering their own stories of setbacks. A widower spoke of still grieving years later, a young woman of rebuilding after job loss, Their honesty reminded Helen that growth was not a straight line. Even storms had value. By the end of the meeting, Helen's chest felt lighter. The rain outside slowed to a drizzle, and the room smelled of coffee and hope. She realized setbacks didn't erase progress, they deepened it. That evening, she wrote, "Storms test us, but they also clear the air." She closed the notebook, knowing that storms both inner and outer were part of her new rhythm of life. Emily invited Helen to speak at a school assembly, sharing her journey with a larger audience. Panic gripped her. Speaking to children was one thing, but a hall filled with parents and teachers was another. Still, she heard her own words echo, "I am ready for more." The night before, she practiced in front of her mirror. Her voice wavered, her hands trembled, but determination held. She thought of the students who had listened to her so intently. If her words could inspire even one person, it would be worth it. On the day she stood on stage, the microphone heavy in her hand, she began with her silence, the empty house, the ocean walks. As she spoke, the hall grew quiet, her words painting pictures of despair and hope. When she finished, the applause stunned her. People approached afterward, thanking her for her honesty. A teacher whispered, "You gave many of us courage today." Tears stung Helen's eyes, but they were tears of release, not sorrow. Back home, she wrote in her journal, "My voice is no longer just mine, it belongs to those who need to hear it." The stage had not destroyed her, it had revealed her strength, and for the first time in years, she looked toward tomorrow with anticipation, not fear. News of her talk spread through town. Strangers greeted Helen at the cafe, saying her words had touched them. She felt a mix of humility and awe. Could her private journey truly inspire others? Margaret reminded her, "Courage is contagious." Helen began to see herself less as a woman who had lost everything, and more as someone who had something to give. The ripple effect of her honesty reached farther than she imagined. Invitations followed another school, a local book club, even the community radio. Each time, fear accompanied her, but so did courage. With every step, she proved to herself that she was capable of more. Her journal filled with reflections on purpose. She realized purpose wasn't a destination, but a path walked daily. Each time she shared, she connected not just with others, but with herself. Emily told her, "The students see you as proof that life doesn't end at 50, it evolves." Helen carried those words like a medal. One evening, after a long day of speaking, she sat by the ocean again. The waves no longer felt distant. They felt like old friends cheering her on. She whispered into the wind, "I am not alone. My story belongs to many." As autumn arrived, the town prepared for its annual festival of lights. Streets glowed with lanterns, and music filled the air. Emily encouraged Helen to read a short piece during the event, a celebration of resilience and community. At first, Helen resisted. Festivals drew large crowds, and she doubted she belonged on such a stage. But Margaret and Emily both insisted. "This is your moment," Margaret said firmly. On the night of the festival, lanterns floated above the harbor, their reflections shimmering on the water. Helen stepped up to the microphone, the crowd buzzing softly. She read about her journey, the silence, the storms, and the rediscovery of hope. As her words carried into the night, lanterns rose higher, glowing like stars. The audience applauded, some wiping tears. For Helen, the moment felt surreal, as if the universe itself had conspired to remind her she had a place in the world again. Afterward, strangers approached, thanking her, sharing their own battles. She realized the festival was not just about lights, it was about shared humanity. That night, she wrote, "Hope shines brightest when shared." The lanterns became a symbol etched into her heart forever. After the festival, Helen was invited to contribute to a local magazine. The editor had heard her speak and believed her words could reach even more people. The offer both thrilled and terrified her. Writing privately was safe. Publishing publicly felt like stepping naked into the world. She hesitated for days, staring at the blank page. Fear whispered she wasn't good enough. But then she remembered her students' applause, the festival's lanterns, the nods of strangers. Perhaps it was time to walk through this new door. She submitted her first piece of reflection on resilience after loss. When it was published, her name printed boldly, she felt both exposed and alive. Messages poured in from readers, thanking her. Helen realized her story had grown beyond her. What had begun in silence was now echoing through the lives of others. She no longer hid in her home. She walked with purpose in the world. That evening, Margaret toasted her at the cafe. To Helen, she said, "Proof that new beginnings can happen at any age." Laughter and warmth filled the air. Helen raised her cup, gratitude swelling inside her. She had opened the door and stepped fully into her new life. Months later, Helen walked again to the beach where it all began. The same waves greeted her, but she was no longer the same woman who once stood lost and broken. She carried scars, yes, but also strength. She opened her journal, now nearly full, and reread her first entry. Alone. Tears came, but not of sorrow, of recognition. She had traveled far from that word, building a life rich with connection and purpose. Children waved to her from the pier, calling her Miss Helen. Neighbors greeted her with warmth. The town that once felt distant now felt like home. She realized she had woven herself back into the fabric of life. The ocean roared, reminding her of its constancy. She whispered, "Thank you for teaching me to move forward." The horizon seemed to stretch wider, as if inviting her to dream again. That night, she wrote her final journal entry in that book. "This chapter is ending, but my story continues." She closed the notebook, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring. And for the first time, the silence of her house no longer frightened. It felt like peace. Helen began teaching writing workshops at the community center, guiding others to find their voices. Her story had blossomed into many stories, each one carrying ripples of hope. She traveled to nearby towns, sharing at schools, cafes, and festivals. Every stage reminded her that courage and connection were not bound by age. Each word she spoke lit sparks in others, just as others had once lit sparks in her. Her home filled again, not with family as before, but with purpose, laughter, and visits from new friends. Margaret often teased, "You're busier now than you were when you worked." Helen laughed, grateful for every full day. One evening, after a workshop, she sat by the ocean. The horizon glowed orange, the waves steady and sure. She thought about her journey from silence to voice, from loneliness to belonging. She knew storms would still come, but she was no longer afraid. She whispered into the wind, "It's never too late to start over." The ocean answered in its timeless rhythm, and Helen smiled. Her life now moved to a beat both steady and free, a new rhythm of life, all her own.